Well, joining me now from Moscow is political scientist and journalist Sergey Markov. In Washington, D.C. is Coffey. He's a former special advisor to the UK Ministry of Defense. In Milan is Eleonora Tafuro Ambrosetti. She's a research fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. And with me here in the studio is TRT World's defense analyst Oubai Shahbandar. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Sergey Markov, who is Russia's big enemy that it has to do such a massive drill like this?
NATO is a Russian enemy, and it's absolutely clear. NATO countries, led by United States and Great Britain, has a hybrid war against Russia. They even don't hide away their plan to dismiss Russian popular and effective President Vladimir Putin and put Russia on the knees. If we have no strong army, they already would attack us. It's absolutely clear.
Okay, so you have to show that you have a strong army.
Absolutely, to defend ourselves exactly as Russia defend ourselves from Adolf Hitler and Napoleon Bonaparte.
Well, hold on. So Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler are used as comparisons or analogous to NATO right now. Is NATO like Adolf Hitler?
Yes. NATO, it's not Adolf Hitler and not Napoleon Bonaparte from point of view that it's not emperors, they're not strong leaders, and they're not so such a criminal as Adolf Hitler. But you know, also the difference between Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler very big. Napoleon Bonaparte was great emperor, and Adolf Hitler was Nazi and criminal who kill a lot of people. But from Russian point of view, both of them have been aggressors against Russia.
Okay.
Same with NATO.
Okay, so Eleonora.
They prepared aggression against NATO.
Okay, so let's bring in Eleonora. Basically, the Russians are defending themselves and they're preparing for all eventualities. And we're not just hearing it from Sergey Markov, we're hearing it from Putin's spokesman, we're hearing it from the chief of staff in the military. This is defensive, not aggressive. Do you buy that?
Well, I think it's not only the military threats that Russia perceives as coming from NATO, and not only in its immediate neighborhood, but also in Syria, Russia wants to show off its military muscle against the US. But I think, if I may add to it like a little nuance, I think that with this exercise that heavily involves China, Russia also wants to show off with China, because we know that the partnership with China is a very asymmetric one. Mm-hmm. And Russia is, of course, a more security-oriented power, whereas China has a much stronger economic might. So this might also add a little nuance to it. China could also be the target of this showing off.
That's interesting, because there's 3,200 Chinese troops as well. One way of looking at it is that the Chinese are actually the target. And that's fascinating. Coffey, 300,000 soldiers, reportedly, 36,000 tanks and so on. It's a big flexing of Russian muscle. Would they be freaking out in NATO headquarters, in the Pentagon, and elsewhere?
Not at all. Russia is a big country with a big military, so it's not surprising that they would have a big military exercise. And I think we need to put this into a little context here. 300,000 troops does sound like a lot. History shows us the actual number will probably be a lot lower. The Russian Ministry of Defense has a habit of inflating these numbers. But 300,000 for a 5-day training exercise once every 40 years or so, which was the last time that they did an exercise this large, really isn't that big of a deal. For example, the U.S., during the height of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, had over 200,000 troops in active combat operations thousands of miles away from the United States for years at a time, not days. So I understand the media sensationalism behind these images and these stories of 300,000 Russian troops exercising. But for a country like Russia, this really isn't anything extraordinary.
Oubai Shahbandar, is this psychological warfare?
A lot of it is a show to project this image that Vladimir Putin wants to send to the West of a resurgent Russia, of a country with a military power that can act as a peer and as a competitor to NATO. Now, the word Vostok in Russian means east, but the audience very much for this military show of firepower is the West, the Western countries. Let's not forget that Russia's military just a decade ago was in shambles and was recovering from the collapse of the Soviet Union and from the wars in Chechnya. It's been able to exponentially advance its military hardware, and the Russians have been investing a significant amount of funds into developing next-generation warfare, next-generation missile systems, and weapon systems to include command and control. But what Russia has really been able to perfect in many ways has been hybrid warfare, not this massive type of conventional military capabilities to launch a war on a continent. What Russia's been able to do in Crimea and Syria really has been the most effectively hybrid warfare using contractors, using other means that NATO is still very much behind. But so far what we're seeing in Vostok is very much a very powerful message to the West that Russia, a resurgent Russian military, is there, although it may be a lot more smoke than actual substance.
Sergey Markov, more smoke than substance. You're projecting strength, but you're not that strong, are you?
Yeah, again, I should remember, it's exactly was ideological slogans of Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler.
They're back.
Both of them told many times, oh, Russia is a weak giant. Just touch it, and this giant has been broken. It was a mistake for Napoleon Bonaparte. It was a mistake for Adolf Hitler. It's a mistake for the NATO. I want to stress another thing. We're absolutely sure that this NATO-led coalition led by United States and Great Britain want to impose an imperial global hegemony. And of course, Russia with its independence and freedom is a problem for them. And they will attack us. But how they will attack us? They will attack us in information war. Everybody could see it. They will attack us in economic war. Everybody could see it. And they will attack us in cyber war. It's also more or less clear. But they will not attack Russia by nuclear rocket missiles. It's already very good. It's better that if we will defend our independence in the information war, in economic war, but not on the nuclear bombing territories.
Right. Okay.
That's why we need
Certainly, that's mutually
army.
assured destruction. Luke Coffey, let's bring you in here. From the Russian perspective, do you at least accept that they have a case when they see these massive war games from NATO and its allies, especially in the Baltics, right on their doorstep, usually run by the United States? They feel, hey, why are you doing this? Why are you pointing your missiles at us? Why are you trying to show us how strong you guys are? We need to react to that. Do you accept that mindset?
Well, the reason why NATO's holding these large-scale training exercises and why the U.S. is so involved through NATO is precisely because of Russia's behavior in its region. It was Russia that invaded Georgia, not the other way around. It was Russia that invaded Ukraine, and not the other way around. And these countries in Central and Eastern Europe have a legitimate security concern coming from Russia. And the U.S. is obligated by a treaty to defend these countries. It's not as if NATO is an offensive alliance. No one in NATO sits around talking about, well, let's invade Russia and conduct regime change in Moscow. This is absurd. NATO is a defensive security alliance. So as long as you don't plan on attacking any member of NATO, you should have nothing to fear from NATO. And that is the reality of it that many in the Kremlin seems unwilling to accept.
Eleonora, what should NATO do?
Well, that's a good question. I am not a NATO expert, so I don't think I can answer to this, but I can give you my humble opinion. I think it is only rational that NATO is increasing its presence in Eastern Europe, because this is a reason for NATO to exist. After the fall of the Soviet Union, actually, many people started thinking, why do we even need NATO? So I think this gives a clear opportunity for NATO to not only continue existing, but also strengthening its capacities. So it is only natural that NATO is there and invest more capabilities in ensuring its members' security.
And I want to talk about a NATO member in a moment, a NATO member that we are currently seated within, Oubai and I. But before that, Sergey Markov, the Chinese. What's in it for the Chinese, and why do you think Russia invited the Chinese?
It's very easily. Both Russia and China, a great independent country, is obstacle for this Anglo-Saxon project of the global hegemony of the whole world. And that's why we're under attack, both Russia and China, by different ways, but nevertheless, we're both on the attack, we're both under the threat, so we had to cooperate. Same time, China has a history, a very long history of having no allies. For them, very difficult to recognize anybody as ally because China, too big civilization, too big country. And that's why it's very small steps towards such alliance between Russia and China. But in fact, we're in the similar situation. We are under attack.
Help me understand this, Oubai Shahbandar. We have the Chinese and the Russians. Of course, the Russians to a massive extent dominating this. This is their drill. It's their show. It's their party. The Mongolians were invited as well. They're there. A small contribution. A bridge between Russia and China, I guess. And then you have the Chinese. They invited Turkey, as far as we understand. Turkey politely said no, but sent observers. What's going on there? Unpack that for me, because Turkey is a NATO member.
Well, there are two really interesting points here. One, the Chinese involvement. Now, this massive military exercise is happening 3,000 kilometers east of Moscow in the vast eastern part of Russia. It's very sparsely populated, and it's been an area of historical competition between China and Russia. During the Soviet era, the United States was able to very shrewdly triangulate and pull China away from the Soviet Union, even though technically they were both communist countries. The Chinese and the Russians even had the Soviet Union at the time in the 1970s, even had a brief shooting war in an area that was very rich in minerals in eastern part of Russia. Now there's a mutual, not alliance, but a convenient partnership given the competition that China is facing with the United States and given the adversarial relationship that Russia faces also with the United States. But let's not forget, there are a lot of Russian nationalists that are still very much wary of dealing with the Chinese and believe the Chinese still have their eyes on the mineral-rich part of eastern Russia. Turkey, let's not forget, Turkey is a very important NATO ally, and we talk about Eastern Europe, but another front line, a point of friction between NATO and Russia is in Syria, where Turkey has a significant amount of presence, to include military observation posts in the northwest province of Idlib, just a few kilometers away from the Russians, an area where we could potentially see a renewed round of fighting between the rebels, some of whom are supported by Russia, and the Assad regime, whom supported by Turkey, and the Assad regime, who is supported by Russia. So another very important point of friction in Syria between NATO and Russia.
Luke Coffey, you're not that worried about this massive exercise, Vostok 2018, but would you concede that if Turkey had to say yes and went along and was a part of this drill, that would be the end of NATO, wouldn't it?
Well, I wouldn't go that far. It would certainly be uncomfortable for NATO, and it would probably cause a ripple. But I would hardly say it would be the end of a security alliance that has been around since 1949, an alliance that's had many ups and downs over the years, but one that has always been able to come out in the end together and stronger as a result. I think Turkey declining the invitation from Russia to participate was merely a continuation of the trilateral meeting we saw in Tehran, where we saw the position of President Erdogan in complete contrast to the positions held by Presidents Rouhani and Putin. And this in itself showed a continuation of animosities, of competition, of conflict between these three countries that goes back for centuries. So no, if Turkey would have decided to join this exercise in whatever capacity, it wouldn't have been the end of NATO. It would have been uncomfortable for NATO, but it's something that the alliance, I think, could have handled.
Sergey Markov, amid all the messages that Russia has been trying to send to its enemies, whether it considers them to be like Napoleon or Hitler or whoever, is one of the messages, hands off our business in Syria. We're supporting Assad. We're getting the job done. Leave us alone. Don't mess with us. Is that one of the messages?
Not exactly. We don't support Bashar Assad itself. You should remember. We support in Syria everybody who is fighting against radical jihadists such as Islamic State and Jabhat al-Nusra. If Bashar Assad, leader of those fighting against radical jihadists, we support Bashar Assad. If others will do, we support them. It's one. And secondly, now we have a very dangerous period when some of the British and American politicians, as you understand, who have feelings that they are losing in Syria, they start to think, oh, probably it is good time to have military attack against Russian and Iranian troops on Syrian territory. And we want to show those American and British politicians, don't attack Russian troops. Even don't think about this.
Okay, so Eleonora, would that be something to take out of Vostok 2018? That there's a message being sent vis-a-vis Syria, and that might actually change the dynamic on the ground in Syria?
I'm not sure whether it might change the dynamics on the ground, but I do think that the current frictions in Syria, they have an impact. And of course, this is all part of this message that that Russia wants to send mainly to the US. But the message, I think, it's not only security based. There's also like an economic component to it. Please don't forget that the military exercise is being held at the same time of the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok,
right,
in which China has also a great role. China and Russia struck a great deal. Alibaba is opening up a Russian branch of AliExpress. This is a massive. This could be a game changer in the business. So this is also a way to say Russia and China are partnering more and more, not only in security-wise, but also economy-wise, and this is also something to take into account.
Yeah, that's right. Money, weapons, soldiers, perhaps showing that they're new players in town, or that perhaps they are equal to the might of the West. Interesting questions, lots of speculation about the meaning of this massive drill. We'll be watching it closely and the aftermath. For the moment, I have to move on. So I'm going to thank you all, Oubai Shahbandar, Sergey Markov, Coffey, and Eleonora Tafuro Ambrosetti. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.